Hi, welcome to the Stories Beside channel. Enjoy watching. This was the first time Brian had been in this office, while the well-groomed, bossy-looking blonde was sitting at her desk. Opposite him was on the phone. Brian furtively looked around the spacious room. The furnishings were stylish, ultra-modern, functional, and immediately obvious, insanely expensive. Brian was flattered in his heart that the CEO of a chain of private clinics was receiving him personally, though she could easily have assigned it to one of her many deputies. "Excuse me, that was a very important call." The tall boss put the phone aside. "Let's continue. So as of this moment, Brian, you are the chief physician of our best clinic. There was not a single objection to your candidacy. An impeccable reputation goes a long way. Your professional credentials are excellent too. I'm not going to lie. I'm proud we were able to get such a brilliant surgeon. I hope you'll live up to our expectations. Of course, most of your time will now be devoted to administrative work. I'll do my best with dignity." Brian nodded, though he was bursting with a kind of unrestrained boyish joy. "Yes, please try." The blonde smiled slightly. "We had enough trouble with your predecessor. By the way, I wanted to know, what made Kurt quit such a prestigious clinic? Did he find a better place?" Brian hesitated. "I'd rather not bring it up," the lady said in an icy tone. "But I'll answer you. We didn't want to make a fuss. That's the only reason we let Kurt resign at his own request. Apparently, he imagined himself a celestial, the decider of all and sundry. In short, financial fraud." "I see. Brian, I'm sorry, but you don't seem happy about your appointment. You look so preoccupied." With some surprise, the CEO remarked, "Oh really, Jessica?" Brian laughed. "It's just that the day after tomorrow I was supposed to fly for a vacation abroad. I haven't had a vacation for 3 years. And here's the thing. But never mind. I just don't want to have to deal with ticket refunds." "Well, it's no big deal." The boss waved his hand with ease. "For how long were you planning to leave? For 2 weeks. So fly, rest easy. Your deputy, Carl, is now acting chief physician and is doing a great job. He has been working in the clinic for 8 years. He is a very responsible and knowledgeable person. And after you've rested, you can go back to work. We need you fresh and rested. There is a lot of work to be done. I'd like to have a rest and go over some documents, get up to speed, so to speak," Brian confessed. "That's possible, of course. I'll make some calls now." Already in the car, Brian took a breath with relief. No vacation abroad was out of the question. In fact, he'd thought it might be nice to go somewhere in August. But there were no last-minute deals or pre-purchased plane tickets. Brian had always trusted his intuition, and now it was telling him not to rush headlong into the deep end without checking it out. Something wasn't adding up in his head. Brian was ready to get to work tomorrow. He had been looking forward to this day for so long. And if it hadn't been for Kurt, that was someone Brian had no doubt about. He had known Kurt since medical school. They had even worked together for 3 years at one of the local hospitals. Kurt was one of the best students in his class, a man of crystal clear integrity. And some kind of nefarious fraud? No way. And if the clinic is having some financial problems, it's certainly not the new chief of staff's fault, who's only been on the job 6 months. So Kurt was set up. But who was it? Brian was going to find out without putting it off. At home, he leafed through an old notebook. He hadn't kept in touch with Kurt in years. It was unlikely the comrade's phone number was still relevant. We should call Gil, the former head of the course, even 20 years after graduation, remained an invaluable source of information for former classmates. Brian was right in his hunch. After 10 minutes of heartfelt thanks to Gil for Kurt's new phone number, he called Kurt. After mutual greetings of unusual worldly chatter, Kurt suddenly supposedly remembered. Yes, Brian had completely forgotten. "Congratulations on your new assignment. You're worthy of it. I hope you do well in this hellhole of a place." "That's actually why I'm calling," Brian confessed. "I'd like to ask you a few questions. Why don't we meet someplace? Talk. Have a drink. I'd love to. But I'm not in Moscow now. I'm visiting my mother-in-law in Sochi. I need to recover from all this filth. You've probably been told that I'm a great swindler. There was a bitterness in Kurt's voice. I didn't believe a word of it, Brian said honestly. I don't know you or anything. I just wanted to ask you what happened there. You were set up, 100%. To be honest, I don't even really understand why the clinic suffered such losses. The mechanism seems to be running smoothly. Everything works like clockwork. No customer complaints. Do you have any idea what kind of people are being treated there? My gullibility ruined me, Kurt confessed. It never even occurred to me that there was something wrong with the clinic. All the records were in order. I did a lot of surgery myself, so I let the administrative tasks go on their own. Fool, what can I say? But do you have any idea who could have set you up like that? Brian wouldn't back down. Anybody. There's a team. Kurt grinned evilly. Actually, without Carl, the cock won't crow. As they say, he's a thorough gray cardinal. That Carl has outblasted 3 chief doctors. He's a sly spider. Kurt's a fool, and he's caught in the spider's net. Kurt laughed unhilariously. After the conversation with his friend, Brian was left with an unpleasant residue. They broke Kurt, you bastards. They spat into his soul with their shameful accusations. But Brian is not so simple. He is not going to answer for the sins of others. So what's the first thing to do? Brian remembered the file folder. Brian already had administrative experience at his previous place of employment. He had held the position of deputy chief physician. We'll have to go through all the paperwork carefully. Maybe we'll find some clue. Brian sat up all night working on the reports. Apparently, his knowledge wasn't enough. All the financial documents seemed to be in order. Then what was the reason for the loss? Shouldn't we show the papers to someone more experienced in such matters? No, it's a long shot. You can't involve a third party. You'd have to solve the tangled puzzles yourself. Or maybe I should give up this homegrown investigation. A treacherous thought occurred to me. Quietly go to work and not play Sherlock Holmes. Kurt, of course, is neither a crook nor a thief. That's out of the question. But he was absent-minded from his youth and was not especially observant. He confessed that he spent more time on surgery than on paperwork, so he was negligent once or twice. And then it went downhill. Money likes to count. After a second, Brian was ashamed of his own thoughts. No, he's not an ostrich. He wouldn't bury his head in the sand. And then he remembered the words of his father, for whom the words about medical honor were not an empty phrase. A doctor without honor and conscience is hopeless. Brian thought he heard his father's soft, slightly husky voice. Our profession takes cruel revenge on the greedy, the indifferent, and the talentless. Sooner or later, some go to court, some lose their gift, and most simply drink themselves to death, stifling any remnants of conscience. Brian smiled at his father's memory. He worshipped him. And was there even one person in the world who could say anything bad about Brian? Brian had grown up in a family of doctors. His father was a surgeon by God, the head doctor of a provincial hospital. Mom, Margaret, a respected general practitioner in the city clinic. From childhood, Brian knew that he would be a surgeon like David, although from an early age he saw all the difficulties of the profession. His father was hardly ever home. He could be called to work in the middle of the night. It was not uncommon for him to rush to the hospital right from the festive table, apologizing to the guests gathered to wish him a happy birthday. I have achieved something in my profession only because of your mother. Often my father repeated fondly, kissing the hand of his beloved wife. Your mother always understood me and accepted me as I am. She and I were one and the same. David was not exaggerating at all. Brian had never once seen a parent fight. Mom was a doctor by profession. She supported her husband in every endeavor. Young Brian secretly dreamed of just such a future wife. In spite of their constant employment, the parents managed to keep up with life as a family. They went out of town. They found time for skiing and camping. On weekends, there were always guests in Brian's spacious apartment. My father's colleagues, my mother's friends, my childhood friends. Many still remembered the taste of Margaret's signature dishes. My parents did not have noisy feasts with heavy drinking. Were they casual lunches and dinners, or just evening tea parties with friends? His father passed away when Brian was barely 23. Tough loving never complained about his health. David literally burned out in a couple of months from an incurable illness. Brian still thanks God that he had time to please the already hopelessly ill David. The red diploma in medicine of the chief doctor of the district hospital varied the whole city. Brian then thought that if at least a third of that number of people came in time to see me off, it meant that my life had not been in vain. It was dawn outside the window. Brian was still sitting at his desk, staring at a pile of papers. No, it wouldn't do any good. He wasn't thinking straight. He needed a good night's sleep. Brian was already dozing when he suddenly remembered a funny story from his childhood. One day, the whole family was watching some historical foreign film. The young reforming king longed to transform his country into an enlightened, developed state. The monarch was very clever, so he did not much believe the reports of the lying nobles, who, to hide their own sins, deliberately misled him to know the whole truth. The young king sometimes staged sneaks into the city. He and two of his most trusted servants would disguise themselves as commoners and, under cover of darkness, sneak out of the palace gates through an underground passage. I envy that king. David laughed at the time. I wish I were like that. A hospital is a kind of small state. You can't keep track of everything, no matter how hard you try to pretend to be a nurse and find out the truth about what's going on inside. I wish I could. Even the babies in the maternity ward knew my face. That's a thought. Brian even raised himself in bed. Yes, an audacious, risky idea. Pure adventure. But it was worth a try. Realizing that there was no way he was going to sleep, Brian headed to the kitchen and brewed himself some coffee with every sip of the fragrant liquid. He was liking the idea more and more. The clinic wasn't expecting a new boss until 2 weeks later. The nursing staff don't know him by sight, but maybe someone has seen his portrait in the newspaper, but sometimes they print such pictures that you can't recognize yourself. If he introduced himself as an ordinary orderly, got a job in a clinic, he'd have plenty of time and opportunity to get to know the inside. Brian took another sip of coffee and paced the room in thought. He'd only seen the Cossacks in the movies before. So what? Well, the idea is good. Adventurous, risky, but quite dual. Well, if they find out, they'll expose him. You can always turn it into a joke. Hardly anyone would dare say to the chief doctor's face that he's prone to idiotic practical jokes. Better, of course, not to find out. Gil would have to call the former head of the course again. Brian barely waited until a decent time for a morning call. Gil High didn't wake him up. Remember, about 1.5 years ago you and I were sitting at the coffee house, and you showed me pictures from your son's birthday party. You were dressed as a black pirate. But remember, of course, you didn't even recognize me at the time. Gil laughed. My friend Vanessa did her best. The makeup artist is first class. I agree, impatiently nodded Brian. Could you give me her number? We were thinking of playing a practical joke on my friend's birthday. He's a good man. We need to be changed beyond recognition. You can count on that. Mother wouldn't know, Gil reassured me. Vanessa Brian, the makeup artist, liked her. She didn't ask unnecessary questions. She answered clearly and to the point. Brian gave her a brief outline of the situation over the phone, saying he wanted to play a joke on a friend. A whole day working as an orderly, under his nose. Ridiculous, Vanessa said discreetly. There is a picture. It's much more efficient to work that way. Whose picture it is? Confused future chief physician. Well, an orderly or something. You want to replace someone specific so that your friend did not arouse any suspicions. You know, Vanessa, I hadn't even thought of that. Well, that's okay. You think over all the nuances and call me, and we'll arrange a meeting. The conversation with the makeup girl sent Brian into a panic. A thought suddenly occurred to him, the first thing that should have occurred to him. What kind of paperwork was he going to show when he was hired? Where would he get his employment book, insurance certificate, and other important pieces of paper without which he would not be allowed on the threshold of a prestigious clinic forged? This is nonsense. Not enough more problems with the law to borrow from someone, and who can bring copies of the documents to lie that the original's burned, for example. Try to persuade him to accept it for a probationary period without the documents that are about to be ready. And if he's not hired, there won't be a second attempt. You want a particular orderly to replace. Suddenly, the words came to mind. Makeup girl Brian. It dawned on me. He needs Scott. Scott won't refuse to help if you tell him the truth. Scott worked as an orderly at the hospital where Brian used to be the deputy chief physician. The entire nursing staff discussed their resemblance in amazement. The men didn't look like twins. But still, people were always surprised when they saw them together. They were both about the same age, a little over 40, the same height. By the way, both had light blonde hair, solid figures, firm cheekbones. True, Scott wore glasses and a small mustache. Brian couldn't stand facial vegetation. Brian usually maintained the necessary distance between himself and his subordinates, but he had a special relationship with Scott. Several years ago, he literally saved Scott's youngest daughter from death by performing a complicated operation. And since then, Scott considered himself eternally indebted to the brilliant surgeon. 3 years ago, Scott had inherited from his grandmother a good quality house in the country with a large plot. Scott had dreamed all his life of tinkering in the ground, of having his own garden. When his dream suddenly came true, the man without a second thought quit his job, got 2 cows, piglets, poultry from his own farm, and fed well at the city market for Scott's sour cream, milk, cottage cheese, vegetables, and fruits. Lines were forming all the goods off the counter in a matter of minutes. Now the village house looked like a toy. There were 2 cars in the yard, one of them quite a decent foreign car. All in all, the former orderly was not poor. Brian just rested soulfully in the countryside, steamed in the bathhouse with fresh milk, drank a basket, plums, and grapes, picked his mother's guests. He liked it. Scott's unusual request of the former boss was not too surprised. He sat and thought. Then Brian spoke. I don't mind lending you my papers. I don't need my employment book yet. You and me, we look alike, and your makeup girl will work. We'll be twins in no time at all. But I think we have to be more subtle here. I'll do it myself, so there won't be a hitch. Why? My documents are my face. Well, how can you do that? And then you go on stage. Not many people pay attention to the orderlies. Sometimes they don't think of them as human beings, so they won't look at you either. It's true that the job of an orderly, though not difficult, is hard. You can do it. Don't even worry about that. Brian grinned. I worked as an orderly at my dad's hospital every summer when I was a student. School was tough. My dad never let me get away with it. The next day, Brian and Scott met in Vanessa's dressing room. The girl was bored as soon as she looked at the men. It's only a half-hour's work. You look a lot alike. Do you wear tinted glasses? She turned to Scott. That's good. You've already got part of your face covered. And you, Brian, you get a haircut and a worse mustache. And it's not even interesting. And the mustache won't come off. Brian was concerned. Insulting customer, snorted the girl. Besides, you only have to wear it for a day. It won't come off. Outside, Brian shared his doubts with his companion. This mustache is really freaking me out. I don't think I can solve everything in 24 hours. It's okay. The mustache is a good thing, Scott reassured him. I'll come back with a mustache. Then you wear it for a day and take it off. It's like you decided to shave off your mustache. And a man without a mustache changes a lot. So no one's gonna catch you cheating. All right, let's go to the market. What for? Brian was surprised. Boss, you're like a Decemberist. What do you mean? Far from the people. Hiding a smile, Scott explained. You're going to play orderlies in your brand clothes. Ordinary people do not dress in boutiques. We'll get you some stage costumes. You can fall down on every little thing around here. You need not only clothes and shoes, but also underwear, socks and towels, shaving supplies, toothpaste, and a purse to match your role. You must have some kind of Cardin's underwear, Calvin Klein. You get naked in the shower somewhere. Do you have Klein under your pants? Don't think the regular orderlies don't know about fashion brands. They can tell the cheap stuff from the good stuff. 2 days later, the implementation operation was underway. Brian drove Scott to the gates of the clinic, and he went to the interview. Brian drove the car to a secluded spot and waited 2 hours for his volunteer assistant Scott to return. Brian was beginning to get impatient. When Scott sat down next to him, Brian immediately pounced on him with questions. Yes, that went well. How else would it have gone? Long. Well, that Carl bastard kept me in the waiting room for an hour and a half. He wanted to show his importance, the slippery guy. But you have to have a good voice to know that, like I do. At first glance, he's a darling. He's a well-groomed man. He's handsome and intelligent. Communicates politely. No authority figures. In short, he's a good eye candy man. He suspected you of what? Scott laughed. Brian, you sure can do it. You think Carl's job description is to catch spies and saboteurs. He's just an ordinary man applying for a job. What's the catch? You see, he came in broad daylight like everybody else, not sneaking in under the cover of night. It's gonna be all right. The only thing is that Carl was surprised that I'm over 40. Said they had mostly young guys. They work as orderlies, and suggested that it would be difficult for me to get along with them. And what did you say? I said 40 years old is not a sentence. I'm experienced. Physical strength, too. My health hasn't let me down yet. Well, what else do you need? Anyway, he put me on probation. Tomorrow morning's your shift. Carl in the face. You know, you'll get to know the others as you go along. Good luck with that. Brian was working at the clinic as an orderly for the 4th day, but he hadn't progressed an inch toward his goal. At first glance, the hospital seemed fine. The clinic ran like a well-oiled machine. The medical staff knew their business excellently on the patient side. And among the rich people, there were sometimes very capricious and picky individuals. There were no special complaints. The private clinic, thanks to its excellent reputation, was a success with the powers that be. So there was no shortage of patients, including those in the VIP rooms. As a newcomer, Brian was hesitant to ask direct questions of his colleagues, especially since the rest of the orderlies kept apart from the old man in their demeanor and did not seem to have any ulterior motives. It was just that the young guys had their own conversations, their own interests, listening to other people's conversations in the canteen and locker room. Brian found that the young guys were very reluctant to work the night shift in order to build relationships with the staff. The man often took over other people's work, coming to the clinic long before work began and letting his replacement go home early. There were no criticisms from the superiors about the new nurse. He was an experienced worker. He knew his job well: to clean, wash, serve the vessel, help the nurses, turn over or change a bedridden patient, prepare a patient for surgery. Brian toiled, diligently conscientious, getting the job done quickly, and one day, meeting the head physician, Carl, in the hallway. Brian stopped him and suggested to Carl, "If you suddenly need to replace someone or go out for the night shift, I would be happy to do it." "That's commendable," Carl said politely. "We could always use an extra pair of hands. But would your wife and daughters like that kind of zeal?" "So all the extra money will go to my girls," said Brian reasonably. "So my family won't mind." Brian wasn't lying. His family really didn't mind. Except he hadn't had any family for a long time. He had been divorced for 5 years. Brian got married at 30, as they say, at a mature age. The young, talented surgeon always liked women. He gladly met with them, beautifully courtship, nobly parted, but was in no hurry to tie himself to the bonds of matrimony. The example of his parents' happy marriage was before his eyes. He wanted to meet the one and only girl and live with her in love and harmony until the end of days. He would always have time to put a stamp in his passport and have children. The respectable young doctor met by chance. He came to his friend's birthday party and he introduced him to his second cousin. Brian fell in love instantly, like a boy. The slender, graceful brunette with blue eyes attracted men's attention like a magnet. Brian asked the girl to dance during a lighthearted conversation, discovered that his new acquaintance is not only charmingly beautiful, but also educated, witty, tactful, and finally lost his head. He proposed to Amelia after 2 weeks of acquaintance and almost went crazy with happiness when the girl told him yes, and she didn't say the cherished word right away. They got married a year later. Brian couldn't get enough of his beautiful wife. His friends and his mother also liked the charming, well-mannered, and hospitable Amelia. The only thing that surprised Brian and his wife was her relentless unwillingness to work. After graduating from the pedagogical university, the girl did not work a day in her specialty. She declared that she was not going to tell the same thing year after year to the negligent, spoiled, and cocky schoolchildren. It seemed to Brian, as a man who literally burned at his job, that without the work he loved, he would die of boredom. Amelia, however, claimed that she had enough to worry about at home too, as a hostess to a young woman. Even the meanest neighbor couldn't complain. The cozy apartment was perfectly clean. Amelia cooked. The cooking was perfect. Every night Brian had a delicious dinner waiting for him at home. The 25-year-old wife did not want to have children yet. At the time, though, Brian did not feel a burning desire to be a father either. At first, Brian believed that Amelia would understand him and support him in everything, just as his mother had supported his father. But with each passing year, Brian became more and more convinced that his dream was not destined to come true. On the one hand, the wife was sincerely proud of the resounding success of her talented husband, who by that time had become a leading surgeon and earned good money. But on the other, Amelia annoyed the hell out of the constant absence of her husband. They even go to rest properly could not. And at the last minute, Brian always had something more important to do, something to do with saving other people's lives. Do you realize you can't save everyone? What kind of Superman are you? If you need to save someone all the time, you can save your own wife from boredom and loneliness without offering me a job. I'm not a bum. I have enough to do at home. We haven't been out together for 100 years. I'm about to forget the human language. A workaholic in these moments, Brian genuinely felt guilty about trusting his beloved wife completely. He suggested she go out and have fun with friends, visit her mother in another city more often, go to a resort with her best friend. At first, his wife was outraged by his words, but one day she decided to take advantage of her husband's proposal and went to Turkey in the company of 2 girlfriends. Amelia became more and more absent from home, almost neglecting all the chores of the household. And sometimes Brian, returning late from work, had to go to bed without waiting for his wife. So he wasn't too surprised when one day Amelia asked him for a divorce, saying that she had fallen in love with another man. The couple had no children. Mutual financial claims too, since Brian left the apartment to his ex-wife. The separation with his wife did not really change Brian's life. Now he could devote himself completely to the business he loved, without the disgusting feeling of guilt. Brian did not allow himself to despair, but a fact is a fact. He had not yet reached his goal. In 10 days, the new head physician was scheduled to assume his duties, if nothing was found out by then. What an impenetrable idiot remains Brian in the eyes of the staff, who, of course, recognized in him an orderly Scot. But soon luck smiled on the surgeon. That night he came to the clinic to start the night shift. Barely had Stepanov had time to change his clothes before the head nurse sent him to the VIP ward. Tyler accidentally knocked over his dinner tray. We need to clean it up immediately. Tyler doesn't like to wait. Hurry, Brian, grabbing a mop and a rag. Up to the 3rd floor. The door to room 12 appeared to be slightly ajar. Brian was about to enter, but the conversation in the room caused him to linger at the door. He saw Tyler, the deputy mayor, holding out a tightly stuffed envelope to the attending physician. "That's the full amount for the treatment. Count it. What are you on, Tyler?" The doctor waved his hands. How can it be counted that the patient paid cash for his stay and treatment in the clinic? Brian became convinced as he cleaned up the shards of broken dishes from the ward floor. Tyler suddenly chuckled. "Yeah, your clinic is expensive. The money's flying in. But they treat you good too." Brian was shocked by what he saw. Why did Tyler give the money to the doctor and not pay for the treatment at the cashier's office? Why did he pay in cash when even the most ignorant pensioners today know how to use a bank card? What are they trying to hide? This morning, when the chief of surgery asked an orderly to mop the floor of his office, Brian decided to ask him a few questions to play the bona fide fool. "Andrew, doesn't your clinic pay through the cash register? That's strange. Such a respectable institution. Do patients give their doctors money in an envelope? Or is that a bribe? What the hell are you talking about? I don't get it. Manager, what bribes? This is a private hospital. You pay the money and you're welcome to it. Of course, all payments go through the cash register. What kind of a weird question is that? I saw Tyler holding out an envelope to one of our doctors yesterday. That's why I was surprised." "Oh well, it's common practice. Our VIPs don't like to bother with things like going to the books and stuff. No big deal. That money ends up in the Vedomosti sooner or later anyway. The clinic doesn't incur any losses anyway." That is a statement Brian would like to argue with. And what a loss. Every unaccounted for patient who occupies someone else's room is a huge loss to the patients who are willing to pay as they should, with nowhere to go because all the rooms are occupied. And such patients are ghosts. They don't bring any income to the clinic. The VIPs are too lazy to deal with the simple procedure of paying for treatment, so they have plenty of helpers for such boring affairs. If the rich customers are paying around the cash register, then into whose pockets is flowing quite a bit of money. Brian was convinced that he had found an explanation for the financial problems. All that remained was to answer the ultimate question of who was behind the machinations. However, he was already suspicious about the person of the main puppeteer. Brian tried to discuss his concerns with his colleagues, but all his attempts failed. It was as if he ran into a wall of incomprehension and mistrust. "Scott, do you want this?" "What? Who? When? Where?" sincerely puzzled the stocky, curly-haired Victor. "Our business is small. You did a good job. You got a salary. And by the way, not a bad one. Why get into all these intricacies? I personally don't give a damn about the VIP section. Let the doctors and admins rack their brains." Faced several times with similar answers, Brian understands. Most likely, the junior nurses also have some stake in the funds that flow to the side, so they prefer to keep their mouths shut. There's a lot of collusion going on among the staff. Brian had no doubt. For just a couple of hours after talking to one of the orderlies, he was summoned to his office by Carl. As soon as Brian entered the office, Carl pounced on him like an enraged Rottweiler. "What do you think you're doing? Scott, who gave you the authority to go around asking strange questions, and I would even say dangerous, provocative questions?" Suddenly Carl's usual politeness failed, and he suddenly switched to you. "Scott, who do you think you are? What are you? Some kind of newspaper patsy? Are you doing your own investigative journalism? What kind of journalist am I, Carl?" Brian kindly threw up his hands. "I'm just a newcomer here, trying to adjust somehow. There are some things I don't understand. So I ask my colleagues. You don't have to understand. It's your business to carry ducks, sanitaire." Carl's all the glamour he's acquired over the years just fell off in an instant. He's out there sniffing around. "You want to lose your job? What do you want to fire me for?" Brian asked reasonably. "I do my work honestly and in good faith. There are no censures. There will be. And I'll make it easy for you," Carl threatened. "You think I can't find something to nail you for? I'd rather you quit your job. You see, you don't fit in here. They pay me good money here. It's silly to quit. You can go." A nurse asked me to help with a difficult patient. Go on then. Tokarev smirked meaningfully, letting the nurse go. From that moment on, it was hard times for Brian. Doctors and nurse mistress, as if in conspiracy, piled him with the heaviest dirty work, with which Brian simply physically could not cope. Under Tokarev's unspoken orders, Nurse Scott's every move was strictly controlled every shift. He was met at the entrance by a nurse, a hostess with an invisible stopwatch in her hands. But the punctual subordinate did not give the supervisor a single chance to catch him being late. The attitude of the fellow orderlies also changed dramatically. The young people avoided any conversation with the ubiquitous old man. They began to mock him openly, reveling in the total impunity of the disgraced orderly. They shunned him like a leper. It got to the point that when Brian appeared in the locker room, everyone who was there abruptly got up and left. Brian felt particularly acute as a black sheep in the mess tent when he approached the table of his coworkers with a tray in his hands, and they would not let him have a seat. The place was taken. Brian had to eat alone at the table, and the chair from which he was pushed for the rest of the meal drew everyone's attention with its gaping emptiness. It cost Brian an enormous effort not to reveal his identity, to feel like an outcast in the collective. It is very hard to endure insults, even when you are playing someone else's role. These few days were for the new chief physician a serious test. However, not everyone was hostile and wary of Sanitizer Scott. One day during lunch, a nurse from the surgery department came up to the table where he was sitting alone. "May I join you?" she asked with a smile, and placed her tray on the table. That wonderful smile, light and bright. Brian noticed her on his first day on the job, when he was helping Nurse Barbara transport a patient to some medical procedures. A connoisseur of female beauty, Brian could not help but notice the seductive legs and slender figure, which even the snow-white robe could not hide. The experienced male gaze photographed everything at once: open gray eyes, plump mouth, flawless skin, cute dimples on the cheeks. She was in her late 30s. One evening, Brian ran into a nurse at the bus stop. Her delicate shoulders were strewn with a luxurious golden-brown mop of hair, which at work Barbara hid under a white cap. Brian was thrilled. And there the lovely creature sat across from Brian, praising the local pastries. "I can't resist these scones. They're soft and fluffy and hot, and the whole diet is out of whack. Soon I won't be able to walk through the door." "You've got a big mouth." Brian laughed, looking at the thin nurse. "Scott, you've been looking a bit down lately. Are you all right?" Barbara asked with sincere concern. "I'm fine. I'm just not the cheerful type. I've never been much of a company man." Brian and Nurse Barbara had lunch together every day since then. They always had something to talk about. It wasn't just looks that Brian liked this girl. Barbara had excellent professional qualities. She worked with pleasure and diligence. She knew how to approach even the most difficult of patients. After work, she did not hurry home, but stayed late at the clinic. One day, Carl came into the room where Brian was making the bed. "Where are you?" he blurted out irritably. As if he'd caught an orderly having a cup of coffee in the break room. "Get the ore cleaned up fast. I'll just finish up here and I'll get to it," Brian calmly replied. "You know, Tyler, if I leave everything here, he'll make such a fuss. Are you deaf? If I don't see you in the ore in a minute, I'll have you fired." He barked and stormed out of the room. Brian was confused. "Go on, Scott." He suddenly felt the soft touch of a hand on his elbow. "Barbara, how did she get here?" "Go ahead, I'll take care of it." The gray eyes glittered affectionately from beneath the cap. "Hurry up, or they'll really fire you. Don't give them that pleasure." At home over a cup of tea, Brian suddenly remembered the nurse's words, "Don't give them that pleasure." Who is that to them? Barbara was obviously not telling the truth. Brian's suspicions were confirmed when, during their next meeting in the canteen, the girl suddenly said, "I know why they treat you like this here. I was even reprimanded the other day and asked if I could find better company for my meals. And you?" I pretended not to take the hint. "I've only been working here 6 months, and I don't like everything either." Maybe the new chief of staff could stop all this. What don't you like? Can you be more specific? Brian rushed the question, and the girl immediately closed up. Some moments Barbara answered evasively and moved the conversation to another topic. The next day, Brian, working the night shift, arrived at work, as always in advance. The doctors and nurses quickly went home. Barbara was the only one who took her time. She sat in the nursing room for a long time, then came out with a large bag in her hands and headed toward the utility room. What was a nurse to do in the kitchen late at night? So hungry she couldn't wait to get home. Brian, burned with curiosity, followed her. The clinic's kitchen was staffed by excellent chefs. For each VIP client, they prepared food according to his taste. But still, the dinner plates were often left untouched and returned to the kitchen. Brian noticed with amazement as Barbara walked over to the table stacked with cooled dishes. She took several small plastic containers out of the bag and began carefully placing the contents of the plates there. Brian was perplexed. Why was she doing this? Suddenly, Barbara felt someone else's eyes on her. She turned around, saw the orderly, and turned pale with fear. "Scott, it's not what you think." Excitedly, she began to make excuses. "I don't steal. You don't think I am." Kelly, the head cook, allowed the same food. "They'll throw it away anyway. No one needs it. I'd rather take it to my children. They're always so happy at hotels like this." "What children?" The man was surprised at my twins. "Didn't I tell you? I have 2 5-year-old tomboys, Eric and Emma." "Oh, how ashamed I am in front of you. I didn't do anything wrong." "This is so embarrassing." Barbara pressed her palms against her flaming cheeks. "It's all right," smiled Brian. "Can I ask you a question? If you have to feed your children hospital food, even the highest quality food, it means your husband makes very little money." "No," the nurse shook her head sadly. "It means that I have no husband." Barbara trustingly told Brian her ingenuous story. She had had a hard time in her life since early childhood. An abandoned child. She knew no parents or family from birth and grew up in an orphanage. "Don't think, Scott. I'm not complaining. I was very lucky to end up in this particular orphanage. The teachers, educators, and nannies were wonderful, and the principal, Pamela, is just a miracle. A heart of gold, a huge soul. Especially Mom encouraged those who strived for knowledge. I always studied well. After school, I went to medical college, graduated with honors. True, I didn't work in my profession for a long time. I married thanks to Charles and his parents. I found my first family. The twins were born so funny, pretty, clever. We were happy. Unbelievable. Not once in 3 years have we had a fight with my husband. Can you believe it? Why only in 3 years?" Brian was surprised. "And then what happened?" "He was killed in a car accident." Barbara answered briefly and closed her eyes in pain. It was as if she was reliving the tragedy that had befallen her. Emma and Eric were barely 2 years old. If it hadn't been for my children, my husband's parents, I don't know how I would have survived all this horror. I had to take every job I could get. I had to live. Of course, my grandparents helped me, but I am ashamed to take money from my elderly parents. Their pensions are small. They spend a lot of money on medicine alone. 6 months ago, I was lucky to get a job in a private clinic. The salary is very good. I'll pay off the loan, and I'll feel better at once. Okay, let's talk about something else." "Barbara." Cautiously, Brian started to talk. "You said you didn't like it here either. What kind of things?" "The same as you," the nurse answered honestly. "Do you think you are the only one who notices how the money for the treatment of VIP clients goes into someone else's pocket? Wouldn't you like to know whose?" "Scott, don't lie. Nothing's done here without permission." "Carl. That sneaky, greedy Bugs had 3 head doctors in his pocket. I'm told he shares his illicit profits with the nursing staff, but it's a pittance. He keeps most of the proceeds for himself. We have 2 clinics here. One is real, and the other is clandestine. I also heard he's been running some kind of scam on rare drugs, but I can't say for sure. How does he pocket the envelopes? I've seen it myself. When the new head doctor comes in, Carl will eat it up. Or maybe he won't. He'll choke on it. Brian was offended by her words for some reason. I'd be happy to. That's all right. Give it time. There will be changes like this in the near future. You're going to be astonished. And your financial situation will get better. I promise. Thank you, Scott. Barbara laughed, taking his words as a joke. How else could she relate to the boastful predictions of an ordinary orderly? Brian. Suddenly, she felt like answering frankness with frankness and opening up to the nurse, telling her the truth. But the insistent ringing of his cell phone prevented him from doing so. All the next day, Brian spent the evening preparing for his appearance at the clinic. As the new chief physician, he reviewed hundreds of times all the notes in his notebook, which he hadn't parted with in the past 2 weeks. Once again, he scrutinized all the documentation. It all fit. All the strings lead to the gray Cardinal Carl. For several years, the deputy had been heating hospitals up with huge sums of money from unlisted VIP patients. This insolent man managed to set up his own clinic in the clinic under the noses of the chief doctors all by himself. As Barbara put it, why, though, did all the nursing staff know about their boss's dealings? Knew and kept quiet, receiving a certain bribe for their poor eyesight. Brian involuntarily envied Carl's cold-blooded courage and brilliant organizational skills. At last, Brian would take off those stupid, simple glasses he never could get used to. With a crunch in his joints, Brian stretched and called Scott. In the early morning hours, a premium car pulled up in front of the clinic's front porch. The driver quickly circled the car and obligingly opened the rear door for the influential passenger. A tall, broad-shouldered man in an expensive suit got out of the car and easily ran up the steps of the porch and went straight to the office of the head doctor. Carl happily sat in someone else's chair. At the sight of the new boss, stunned. Carl didn't realize it was a practical joke. He stared at Brian in confusion. Scott, what's going on? Are you talking to me? The new chief of medicine marveled. What exactly are you talking about? Don't mind me. Carl jumped up, giving way to his superior. Would you like some tea? Alas, we are not going to have tea now. Brian sat down comfortably in his chair. A bottle of cognac will not suffice here, but alcohol during working hours, you know. While I was resting, my men did not sit idly by and got some very interesting information for me. Sit down, Carl. It's going to be a long talk. After an hour, Carl wiped his forehead covered with sweat with his handkerchief and said quietly, You can't prove anything. It is only a supposition, unsupported by any evidence. You have no proof. I have all the evidence and witnesses. Take your word for it. But there will always be people eager to get even with the greedy and avaricious boss, who lately has practically stopped sharing his booty. Brian bluffed desperately, but Carl believed him. You want to make a big deal out of this. I don't. I've got something too, Carl grinned. Do you think the media would like a story about a crazy surgeon who disguised himself as an orderly to expose villains who don't exist? A mania of persecution, so to speak. You think I didn't recognize you? At that time, there was a knock on the door. Scott himself looked in. Oh, sorry, I interrupted Carl. I'm quitting. Where do you want me to go? To human resources? Where else? Instead of Carl. The new chief of staff said to the orderly, You're a grown man indeed. Can't you see this is a serious conversation? I apologize. Scott hurriedly closed the door. To say that the deputy was shocked was to say nothing. Completely taken aback by this turn of events, he didn't even notice that Scott had managed to grow a small but thick mustache in just one night. I'll pay the money back, in a balletic voice, Carl promised. Most of it. Brian grinned bitterly. A lot of time has been lost. Unfortunately for us, and fortunately for you, we're unlikely to know how much money you've managed to steal over the years. You're fired. Maybe you'll let me resign, hopelessly asked the deputy. Are you fired? Brian replied nonchalantly, and thinking that you're the bastard for Kurt. In a few hours, the whole clinic was on its ear. The news of the omnipotent Carl's dismissal spread through the hospital at the speed of sound. The shocked staff whispered about the unpredictable behavior of the new chief physician. They did not know what to expect from this autocrat in the near future. The fact that Brian looked remarkably like an orderly, Scott made far less of an impression on the staff than Brian had anticipated. People were more worried about their own fate. After lunch, the entire nursing staff gathered in the conference room. At the behest of the new management, Brian stood before the staff and, after greeting them, gave a brief but impressive speech. You all know about the firing of the acting chief physician. You all know the sins for which he was fired. You're no saints yourselves. And if I could, I would fire practically everyone in this room right now. But highly qualified people are worth their weight in gold these days. You are excellent specialists. A little more conscience and honesty would be nice, but that's everyone's personal choice. From now on, a new life begins at the clinic. If anyone doesn't agree with the new policy, I'm waiting for your resignation letter. It's up to you to stick me in the wheel now. Not gonna happen. I'm warning you right now. Well, I guess this is it. Go back to work. Are you expecting patients? A week later, the new chief physician, to the great surprise of the staff, appointed Barbara as head nurse. At the end of the day, there was a timid knock on the door of his office. May I, Brian? Please have a seat. Thank you. The nurse cautiously sat down on the edge of her chair. I'm very grateful for your appointment, but I'm sorry, let me ask you straight out, why me? I've been working here less than a week. There are more worthy candidates, the most worthy. I've already chosen, said Brian firmly. I'm completely satisfied with your professional qualities. What's a week old have to do with it? And what are you upset about exactly? You haven't got anyone under your thumb. Samantha has taken a well-deserved retirement of her own free will. Remember how happy she was to be able to spend more time with her beloved grandchildren. You should have said thank you. Thank you very much in a hurry, Barbara, without noticing the sly smile in his eyes. Actually, a simple thank you. You can't get away with that. May I take advantage of my position and invite you to dinner? You may. And I can think about an answer. Of course you can. The nurse turned around on the doorstep. I've already thought of Saturday at 6:00 p.m. I'm free. Thanks for the invitation, Scott. I had lunch with you every day. Did you really think I wouldn't find out? Barbara laughed reproachfully and left the office, leaving Brian to burn with shame. 6 months passed. The profits of the clinic grew before their eyes. The shareholders and board of directors couldn't be happy about the new chief physician. In Brian's personal life, too, serious changes were taking place. He had been dating Barbara for almost 5 months. It was love, real, sincere, unconditional, and mutual. One evening when he walked Barbara home, Brian didn't let her out of the car for a long time. Before he said a few cherished words, he gathered his spirits like an excited schoolboy. Look, I would have proposed to you a long time ago, if it weren't for one thing. Finally came out Brian. What was that? Barbara was surprised. I have not yet received the permission of 2 very important people, Emma and Eric, he explained to the distracted couple. Don't you think they should meet their future stepmother? You're so sure I'm going to tell you, aren't you? Here's a tease, the young woman teased him. Honestly, I'm sure, Brian admitted. Somehow. Or am I wrong? You're not wrong. Barbara reached out to him. Over the weekend, Brian and Barbara and the twins visited an amusement park. The little company had a wonderful time with Emma and Eric, and Mum's good friend. Very much enjoyed Uncle Brian. Happy to play with them, fooling around, generously treating them to all sorts of goodies in the cozy children's cafe, and louder than the kids, screaming at scary rides. Are you acting like a boy? Gently whispered Barbara. She kissed him on the cheek. Does that upset you? Brian scratched the back of his head, puzzled. On the contrary, I'm thrilled. Do the children like you that much? The eyes of the woman she loved shone with happiness. On the way home in the car, Brian asked the kids, what was your favorite thing about today? All the twins answered in unison. After a short silence, "And if you had lived with us," Emma coyly added, "it would have been even more fun." "Really? But I'd have to marry your mother to do that." Brian cheerfully winked at Barbara. "Marry her?" the children shouted in chorus. "You have to get her permission first. She says yes. We know our mother better than that. If she smiles like that, it means she agrees," Emma reassured them. "Mummy, tell me if she agrees." "Really?" Barbara nodded. The twins, overwhelmed with vivid impressions, fell asleep right in the car. Brian helped his sweetheart carry the children home and put them to bed. Saying goodbye in the hallway, the new groom smiled guiltily. "Barbara, I'm sorry that such a spontaneous proposal turned out. Do not be upset. I'll be sure to make everything beautiful. The restaurant, the ring, the candles, the sea of flowers." "What kind of a fool are you, Brian?" Barbara, who needs a hug. "It's corny with candles and rose petals. It's the kind of marriage proposal I couldn't even dream of." "Did you see the kids cheering?" "Of course I did. Now all you have to do is meet my mother." "It's kind of scary, Brian," Barbara admitted. "What if she doesn't like me?" "Are you crazy?" Brian was indignant. "How could she not like you? My mom is amazing. She'll know right away what a treasure her son has got. Besides, we'll take all the heavy artillery with us against Emma and Eric. No one can resist. They will charm anyone." The lovers did not hold a lavish celebration and celebrated the wedding in a cozy restaurant among close friends and relatives. On such an important day for Brian, it was nice to see his favorite mother cousin Scott with his wife and daughters Gil, with his husband Kurt, with his wife and grandparents Emma and Eric. For 2 months now, Felix has been the deputy chief physician at the Brian Clinic, dancing with his adoringly beautiful wife. Brian felt like an infinitely happy man, and Barbara nodded behind him with a smile. "Look at this." Brian turned around and saw the joyful twins. They were wrapped around both sides of their new grandmother. Margaret looked 20 years younger. She was enjoying it so much with her grandchildren. "Brian, I'd like to make an appointment with you." His wife surprised him. "For God's sake. What's the matter?" "A personal matter." "Of course. You can't solve it at home." "We can," Barbara agreed. "But I would still like it to be in a more formal setting." On Wednesday, as promised, Barbara went to the doctor's office. Brian had already forgotten all about the wedding. "I'm listening to you, Barbara." "Brian, I'd like to talk to you about a new head nurse. Do you think Sherry is the right person for the job?" "But the position has already been filled, hasn't it?" Cautiously, Brian played along, not sure where his wife was going with this. "Or are you going somewhere?" "Not right away, I hope." "No," Barbara agreed. "Not now, but in a couple of months I'll have to leave this post. Why don't you worry about a suitable replacement?" "Are you serious or are you joking?" Brian didn't get it. "Somebody hinted that the chief's wife enjoys a special position, and you've decided to leave the clinic for good. Why permanently?" "Just maternity leave." Barbara liked to watch her confused husband. "What maternity leave?" Brian was puzzled. "Brian, well, you've completely sighed, Barbara. You don't know what kind of maternity leave women go on. And we're having a baby that we love. Are you excited?" It was as if the joyful news stunned Brian. He looked at his wife with delight, feeling the happy tears rise to his throat, and could not utter a word. Their firstborn son was named David, after Brian's father. "You are excellent specialists. A little more conscience and honesty would be nice, but that's everyone's personal choice. From now on, a new life begins at the clinic. If anyone doesn't agree with the new policy, I'm waiting for your resignation letter. It's up to you to stick me in the wheel now." "Not gonna happen. I'm warning you right now." "Well, I guess this is it. Go back to work. Are you expecting patients?" A week later, the new chief physician, to the great surprise of the staff, appointed Barbara as head nurse. At the end of the day, there was a timid knock on the door of his office. "May I, Brian? Please have a seat." "Thank you." The nurse cautiously sat down on the edge of her chair. "I'm very grateful for your appointment, but I'm sorry, let me ask you straight out. Why me? I've been working here less than a week. There are more worthy candidates, the most worthy. I've already chosen, said Brian firmly. I'm completely satisfied with your professional qualities. What's a week old have to do with it? And what are you upset about exactly? You haven't got anyone under your thumb. Samantha has taken a well-deserved retirement of her own free will. Remember how happy she was to be able to spend more time with her beloved grandchildren. You should have said thank you. Thank you very much in a hurry, Barbara, without noticing the sly smile in his eyes. Actually, a simple thank you. You can't get away with that. May I take advantage of my position and invite you to dinner? You may. And I can think about an answer. Of course you can. The nurse turned around on the doorstep. I've already thought of Saturday at 6:00 p.m. I'm free. Thanks for the invitation, Scott. I had lunch with you every day. Did you really think I wouldn't find out? Barbara laughed reproachfully and left the office, leaving Brian to burn with shame. 6 months passed. The profits of the clinic grew before their eyes. The shareholders and board of directors couldn't be happy about the new chief physician. In Brian's personal life, too, serious changes were taking place. He had been dating Barbara for almost 5 months. It was love, real, sincere, unconditional, and mutual. One evening when he walked Barbara home, Brian didn't let her out of the car for a long time. Before he said a few cherished words, he gathered his spirits like an excited schoolboy. Look, I would have proposed to you a long time ago, if it weren't for one thing. Finally came out Brian. What was that? Barbara was surprised. I have not yet received the permission of 2 very important people, Emma and Eric, he explained to the distracted couple. Don't you think they should meet their future stepmother? You're so sure I'm going to tell you, aren't you? Here's a tease the young woman teased him. Honestly, I'm sure, Brian admitted. Somehow. Or am I wrong? You're not wrong. Barbara reached out to him. Over the weekend, Brian and Barbara and the twins visited an amusement park. The little company had a wonderful time with Emma and Eric, and Mom's good friend.